Welcome and thank you all for coming. It's been a wonderful day so far. Some very exciting panels on Clean Power Plan and on natural resources policy looking forward. And now we're going to loop back into the other tripod of the federal energy, environmental, natural resources spectrum and talk about energy policy in the next administration. So as we've heard from some of the prior panels today, and as we'll explore further on this panel, the energy sector has shifted a great deal over the last 8 years of the Obama administration. Coal's stronghold on electricity generation has weakened significantly, largely due to cheap natural gas. And in the background, renewables and other new technologies have been expanding greatly across the country. Our grid has been evolving as more consumer-side technologies move us closer to a world where electricity users are both producers and consumers. The Department of Energy has been active in helping to develop cutting-edge technology. FERC has engaged with a number of key jurisdictional and policy issues regarding the modernization of the grid. And states like New York with the Reforming the Energy Vision program have been grappling with how to integrate distributed energy resources efficiently and effectively into the grid, as well as how to design electricity rates to provide the proper incentives to users. We have 4 excellent panelists with a wide range and tremendous depth of experience to help us explore these issues today. We'll be assessing where we've come from on energy policy and where we're going. We will start with short presentations from each of the panelists and reserve the majority of the time for questions from me and from the group. So first I'll introduce all of our panelists, and then they'll come up and speak one by one. So our first speaker today is Stephen Croley. He's the General Counsel of the U.S. Department of Energy. In addition to being General Counsel, he previously served in the White House as White House Counsel's office as Deputy White House Counsel and as Senior Counsel to the President. He also was Special Assistant to the President for Justice and Regulatory Policy on the White House Domestic Policy Council. He also is on leave as professor at University of Michigan Law School and author of a wide range of articles and books on electricity and the regulatory process. And our second speaker is Max Minzner, who is General Counsel of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. I think I may have accidentally said that Steve was General Counsel of that. He's General Counsel of the Department of Energy. Max Minzner is General Counsel of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. He's also a professor on leave from the University of New Mexico School of Law, where he teaches and writes on the issues of criminal law, criminal and civil procedure, and administrative agency enforcement. He has also been an assistant U.S. attorney, special counsel to the director in the Office of Enforcement at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and has worked on a number of issues on enforcement. And then our third speaker is Paul Sotkiewicz.
Watching how to show. Very good.
Who was until recently the lead economist for PJM Interconnection, LLC, and is currently the president and founder of E-Cubed Policy Associates in a consultancy in Florida. He has many years of experience with the interconnected electricity markets and has also served as a professor or director of energy studies at the Public University Research Center at the University of Florida. And our final speaker today is Allison Clements, who is a senior attorney at Natural Resources Defense Council. Until recently, she was the director of NRDC's Sustainable FERC project. The project is a coalition of energy policy and environmental nonprofit organizations at FERC and the ISO, Independent System Operator and Regional Transmission Organization level, trying to work in pursuit of a clean, affordable, and reliable transmission system that accelerates deployment of renewable energy and demand-side resources. She also served as a project finance attorney at a private law firm here in New York and has substantial experience in the energy sector. So I look forward to hearing insights from these speakers.
Well, thank you so much. And thanks to Ricky and the entire Institute for having us. So I enjoyed Phil's metaphor of a movie. I'm going to switch genres a little bit to a song, and I'm going to sing the chorus. So you've heard it a couple times today already, but I think with repetition, maybe you'll learn the lyrics. So I'm borrowing a little bit from what Sue provided in the last panel and David this morning, which is kind of the big picture on fuel sources. But I want to save a minute of my time to talk a little bit about what the Department of Energy has done in the recent past, and what I think it's likely to do in the future with respect to fuels. So first, a quick accounting of clean energy. And again, others have covered a little bit of this, but let's have a common set of facts. And then I want to, second, take a little bit of a reality check and talk about the trend lines in fossil fuels as well, and how those compare, which was anticipated by one of the recent questions. And then thirdly, and finally, as I say, I want to speak a little bit about the department's role. Okay, so first up, solar. You've heard a lot about solar. Let me be precise. I promise not to commit the sin of providing you with lots of facts and statistics. On the other hand, it's good to be precise. So cost of solar has fallen by more than 50%, and I'm looking now at the past 5-year time window. The cost of solar cells, in particular, have fallen 80% over that same 5-year window. And as a result, the LCOE, the levelized cost of electricity for solar, is now approaching, or has approached in some parts of the country, the cost of electricity from traditional fossil sources. And those trajectories, the trend lines, if other speakers have put it, are continued downward. Therefore, utility scale solar over this 5-year period is up more than double, and distributed solar is up 900%. For 2016, again to be precise, we will see 9.5 gigawatts of new solar capacity. That will make solar for 2016 the largest source of new capacity. Solar was up also in 15 and up also in 14. Okay, on the wind side, let's do the same exercise. Past 5 years, what is the picture? Here again, we have a doubling of wind generation. Now EIA announced that there are 11 states that get more than 10% of their power from wind. A significant subset of those get much more than 10%. And those states, not to put too fine a point on it, are all over the map. I said that solar was the #1 source of new capacity for 2016. For 2015, wind was #1. And if you take wind and solar together, they comprise 70% of new capacity for 2015. I want to make one point that maybe has only been made implicitly so far today, and that's this. The trends I'm describing characterize the United States, but also the rest of the globe, that we see comparable increases in renewable investments in capacity in generation worldwide. So that solar is the #1 source globally of new electric generation, new electric capacity and generation. And EIA predicts that by the year, I think this is a stunning statistic, by 2040, that renewables together will catch and equal coal and natural gas, each at between 28 and 29% of electricity generation worldwide. Now, these trend lines, as others have put it, assume that improvements in technology are more or less linear, that we will continue to see more or less linear improvements in technology. If we relax that assumption, which, who knows, and imagine leapfrog technologies, to anticipate where I'm going to go in a few minutes, then we would expect an accelerated adoption of renewables, point 1. Point 2, in the nature of a counterpoint or reality check, I'd like to argue against myself. And that is, notwithstanding the steep growth in absolute terms of renewable generation and capacity, today, as a questioner pointed out a few minutes ago, solar accounts for 2% of capacity, 1% of generation. Wind is around 7.5% of capacity, 5 to 6% of generation. And if you think of the current generation of our electrical power, and we can talk about transportation also, the breakdown is like this: 33% gas, 32% coal, 19-20% nuclear. Do that math real quick, 84%. That leaves 16% for everything else, which is wind, solar, and hydro. And in fact, I have a slide here if I can work the. So, geeky confession, I have this graphic on the wall of my office, just so that I could commit it to memory. So on one side of the slide, I won't go through this, but I recommend it to you. You can find it at eia.gov for those of you who don't yet have it on the wall of your office, but we can change that. So one column is sources of energy. This includes transportation, obviously, the other, the sectors that it goes to. Here's a really happy, convenient coincidence that the sources and their use is expressed in BTUs, and it just so happens that we're around 100 BTUs, so you can kind of translate these to percentages, and it roughly, quads, thank you. The quads and the percentages roughly match. I'm going to recommend one more graphic to you, and then I'll be done with my graphics. Whoops. No, that's someone else. Aha. Here's basically the same thing by Lawrence Livermore. Again, it's in quads, 97, 98 total quads. The difference here, and you can find this off of Lawrence Livermore's website, which you should do, and I'm preaching partly to you students here, but also others. It's the same as EIA's data, and it's consistent with EIA's data. What this captures is energy losses, because it takes energy to make energy, so to speak. And so this kind of captures deadweight losses, but it's a little more cumbersome. So I'm going to go back to this. So as you can see here, this is total energy now, so it includes transportation, not just electric generation. The percentages that I mentioned before were for electric power. Now, let's take that same 5-year window that I mentioned a minute ago with respect to renewable growth. So here's the growth in fossil. Oil production is up 4 million barrels a day to have approximated in 2015 the all-time annual high in the United States, which was in 1970, 9.6 total million barrels a day. Most of that growth, almost all of that growth, is from tight oil. And EIA projects that tight oil production will double by 2040. So that is a massive, both in an absolute sense and in a relative sense, that is a massive increase. It's an increase as a result of the same underlying forces, which are technological improvements. So now it's technological improvements on the conventional production side as opposed to the renewable side. That's for oil. How about gas? Similarly staggering. So gas production, same 5-year window, is up 7.5 trillion cubic feet to a total annual of 27, 28 trillion cubic feet. Again, this growth, as you all well know, is from fracking. So here's that trend line. 2000, 1% of natural gas, domestic natural gas production from fracking. 2010, 20%. 2016, 66%. And EIA projects that to go to 75% in the next few years. What all this means is that now the United States is the #1 producer of oil and gas, including natural gas liquids. So the capacious category, oil and gas, #1 producer in the world. And make no mistake, this is a welcome thing. It has obvious implications for energy security and will make the United States a net energy exporter by 2040, according to EIA. So let me now turn to the department's role in this reality check on fuel sources. So our mantra is an answer to a question. And the question is, what sources of fuel do you, the Department of Energy, promote? And our mantra is all of the above. And it lends itself to caricature, perhaps, but we're actually serious. We're actually serious about it. We promote the energy sector, one of our core missions, by collaborating with it. And the tools that we use include supercomputer capacity, the use of our national laboratories, the gem of the United States scientific community, our power to convene, our power to be honest brokers, our power to be research collaborators. And we do this across fossil sources and non-fossil sources alike. So we have invested heavily in CCS. I expect the Department of Energy in the future to continue to invest in CCS. We absolutely invest in how to, again, to return to a previous question, how to do better on transportation efficiency. I'll give you one example because concrete examples are helpful. We did something called the Super Truck Initiative. So this was a challenge to truck manufacturers, Daimler, Peterbilt, Clements, to improve highway trucking efficiency. And the initiative, we put in some seed money. It was in the millions. It wasn't a huge amount of dollars, but kind of a challenge. Daimler won it. They improved their highway freight efficiency by 115%. So successful, we're going to do it again. We announced a few weeks ago, Super Truck 2. And again, the challenge is to improve freight efficiency. Why? So tractor-trailer trucks constitute only 4% of the vehicles on the highway. They consume 20% of transportation fuels. And super trucks will be here today. They will be here in the next administration. They will be here in the administration after that. They ship, they ship as many as 80% of the nation's goods. On the nuclear side, somebody mentioned nuclear. We have invested and collaborated, and we will continue to do this, I would expect, on small modular reactors. We have engaged with a consortium to put some small modular reactors, up to a dozen of them, on one of our lab sites in the Pacific Northwest. We'll continue to be bullish on that, I would expect. Utility scale solar. So of all of the departments of the federal government, now this is my personal opinion, that would threaten or expose the false dichotomy between the market and the government, I would submit the Department of Energy as a candidate for exposing that false dichotomy, because what we've done is partnered with market participants. And by that I mean Fortune 50 companies, Fortune 10 companies, garage entrepreneurs, universities, again, our labs, the RTOs, all to push the energy production possibility frontier outward. Utility scale solar is my favorite, perhaps, example. So in the United States, the first 5 utility scale solar projects were done with financial assistance from the Loan Program Office. The following 45, which is to say all of them after that, were not. They were undertaken by private market actors reacting to market incentives and various policy carrots and sticks, which others have mentioned. Renewable fuel standards in the states and production tax credits. So we'll continue to do that. And I might just say as an aside, energy is about more things than fuel production, even though I focused on that. Let me give you one other, or at least one other vivid example. We've collaborated with big companies that include Dow and Monsanto, big agro, you might say, on the one hand, and IBM and Google, big analytics, you might say, on the other hand. And we have, again, provided supercomputing capacity to this consortium, among other fairly modest resources, to develop a plant, a farm in Arizona. This farm the footprint is roughly 4 football fields large. And the world's largest existing robot lives above this farm and travels on a large crane 24/7. And what this robot does is take highly detailed measurements of crops growing beneath it. Soil content, moisture content, leaf size, root size. And this robot is looking for the exceptional phenotype, this exceptional plant that thrives when its brothers and sisters do not. So the agricultural implications of this are fairly obvious, which explains why the Dows and the Monsantos are interested in it. But so are the climate implications, because someone alluded to this without specificity earlier this morning. If you could increase certain crop yields by 2 to 3%, the CO2 implications of that approximate the CAFE standards. So we are pushing that kind of science as well. One more example, because it's vivid. I had the privilege of visiting one of our experimental wind farms recently. And so many of you know this, but I didn't, that wind, the point of wind is optimizing the efficiency of each turbine. And to do that, they must speak to each other, much as a flock of geese, have to communicate for optimal air efficiency as they fly, or fish communicate for optimal efficiency. So again, using our supercomputer capacities, we allow the wind turbines to communicate to each other in real time to make adjustments to accommodate the relative positions of the others. And in fact, they now get signals upwind from robots informing them of the speed and direction that the wind is traveling before it hits the wind farm. Again, all in the interest of efficiency. Now, the private market,
Does that really work?
Yes, it does really work.
What sort of improvement in efficiency you get?
Well, you got to come out to the lab. I'll walk you through
It's
the.
in Colorado, isn't it?
Yes, it's not Colorado, and you can get tours. So I'm not joking entirely. Yeah, you can. Yeah, of course. So So look, all of this science is very much, is very exciting, it's very much underway. But here's the point that I want to conclude with. This is the market at work, it's the government at work, it's the universities at work, it's the labs at work. And this work is being done because market forces require it, global preferences require it, local preferences require it, and the incentives of market participants require it. So we at the DOE will continue, I would predict, to be a convener, a collaborator, a scientific honest broker to promote different sorts of fuels, and especially renewable fuels. The most recent instantiation of this is something that probably many of you have heard of, but if not, it's worth mentioning, which is an initiative called Mission Innovation. And this is the epitome of public-private partnership. Mission Innovation, announced at Paris, was an effort. It's now 22, I think, state members, country members, who have pledged to double their clean energy R&D between now and 2021. As a result, or as an incentive for such a doubling, the Breakthrough Energy Coalition has agreed to match that doubling with private money. So this is private money. These are investors who intend and expect to see a return on their private investments in clean energy R&D, but they will show some patience, let's say, with respect to the time horizon for realizing their returns. The collateral benefits of this are fantastic in the sense that this is about U.S. economic growth. It's about supplying the world with technologies that will be supplied either by United States companies or other companies. And our preference is for the United States to be in the position to meet what I suggested earlier is a growing global demand. So costs have fallen, to return to my first point and end with it, costs have fallen not because costs fall in the abstract. Costs fall because of research. And research is undertaken because there are incentives for the yield on that research. That has been a core part, indeed the core part probably, of the Department of Energy's mission. I expect that to continue. Thank you very much for listening.
So thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. Ricky, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for that introduction. I'm Max Minzner. I'm the General Counsel at FERC. And I am just really looking forward to the chance to continue this discussion over the future of anthropology in the United States. I don't have a song or a reference to a movie that I can do. I'm mostly here because I want to talk about structure. In structure in sort of two key ways. First is the structure of the energy markets, and particularly the wholesale electric markets in the United States, which are FERC jurisdictional and FERC regulated. And then I want to talk a little bit about the developing and moving line between state and federal jurisdiction in the energy space. So let me start with the discussion of the markets. And I think it's useful to think about this question because the topic of market and market forces has been so central to what we've been hearing today so far. Broadly speaking, it isn't completely accurate to say that there is a market for energy, for electric energy in the United States. In fact, there are markets. FERC's economic regulatory obligation under the Federal Power Act is to ensure that the rates for its jurisdictional products, which are transmission and the wholesale sale of electric power, are just, reasonable, not unduly discriminatory or preferential. One of the mechanisms, right now I would say the core mechanism that FERC has used to carry out that statutory responsibility has been to incentivize and oversee the creation of multiple regional organized electric markets. On the map here, you can see the markets as they exist in North America. Notably, not all of these are FERC jurisdictional. Quite obviously, the two Canadian markets aren't subject to the oversight of FERC. And some of you may know that the Texas market is also not federally regulated. That portion of Texas there in sort of the dark blue is electrically isolated from the rest of the United States. It is not in interstate commerce because it's not interconnected. And as a result, it is solely regulated by Texas. We do have then, though, 6 organized wholesale electric markets in the United States, the California ISO, the Southwest Power Pool, the Mid-Continent ISO, PJM, New York ISO, which is where we are now, and the New England ISO. They do serve the substantial majority of the electric load in the country, but significant portions of the United States do not exist in one of these markets, notably the Intermountain West and the Southeast markets. I think it's useful to understand these markets, think about how we got here. If you start with a very traditional model of a vertically integrated utility, you can think about somebody who has an obligation to serve its customers, serve load, owns generation, and owns the transmission lines to get power from that generation to that load. There's no market there. You have somebody running a generator, supplying power, usually under a traditionally regulated structure. Either a state or a federal regulator would oversee the rates that are being charged. And the reason for that's pretty straightforward. If you have that model, you have real market power issues in terms of what the appropriate price is. As the electric industry has evolved, though, over the last 50 years or so, you saw efforts to introduce market forces into that type of structure. One of the earliest examples of that was reserve sharing agreements. So if you think about two neighboring utilities, they might not both want to build a backup generator, so they might come to an agreement that they would share the output of one backup generator that either could call on when necessary. You begin to see, as a next step, the development of power pools, where utilities would agree to serve their load together out of the same pool of generation. Certainly the New England Power Pool is a famous example of that. The move toward more structured markets really at the federal level kicked off about 20 years ago with FERC's Order 888, which required transmission owners to provide open access to their transmission system, to permit others to transmit power over their lines. One way to ensure that open access obligation that FERC has made clear is appropriate is through the participation in a regional transmission organization. The RTO structure involves transmission owners turning over control of their transmission system to the RTO, who is a public utility regulated by FERC in its own right. That RTO then will manage the transmission system and most notably will operate a market for electric power. There are a variety of products that are traded in the RTOs. First, the most basic one to think about, I think, is the market for electric energy that occurs in real time. So generators will offer to supply power on a 5-minute basis. Load, the consumers of energy, will show up and put in bids to buy power. The RTO will match those offers to buy and sell, subject to the locational constraints of the grid. Of course, you can't have every generator available to serve every load because there are transmission constraints, and those may change over time as generators are available or not available, as weather means transmission lines are available or not available. In addition to that real-time market, there's a day-ahead market where generators and load make financially binding commitments to show up the next day. Most of the actual activity occurs in the day-ahead market that then settles out in the real-time market. On a further forward basis, many of the markets, but not all of them, have structures for capacity, which you can think of as sort of a call option on generation. Generation and other resources like demand response will make offers, promises to show up in the energy markets 2 or 3 years from now in exchange for payments. That stream of payments may permit the construction of a new power plant. Those market structures are the mechanisms by which, as we've been talking about, for instance, the low gas prices that have come over the last 10 years have permitted gas generation to replace coal in many parts of the country because the gas fired units are competitive in a way as a result of this change in the underlying commodity. Their offers are accepted more frequently, and they're the ones serving load rather than the older coal units. One thing that I think is worth noting in the map in front of you on the regional transmission organizations is the role of the states. It certainly, I think, is probably noteworthy that we have some organized markets that roughly follow state lines. The California ISO and New York ISO are largely single state organized markets. The New England ISO, of course, is a market that serves the 6 New England states and only the 6 New England states. Other markets, PJM, MISO, and SPP, don't naturally follow state lines and, in fact, are intermixed with each other. This, along with many other issues, raises questions of the intersection between state and federal policy. I had mentioned the capacity markets. Some of you may know that resource adequacy, ensuring adequate generation, is a classically state responsibility in the electric field. The capacity markets are one way that capacity, though, is made available, and there was litigation on the question of the appropriateness of having FERC jurisdictional markets to ensure resource adequacy. That question of the state and federal divide in these areas is one that has been litigated frequently over the last several years. And notably to me at least, we've had 3 U.S. Supreme Court decisions in the last 18 months on the line between state and federal jurisdiction. I think that's particularly striking from a court that's only taking about 90 cases a year. To have 3 on FERC jurisdiction is kind of incredible. Those 3 cases, One Oak, FERC v. EPSA, and Hughes versus Talon, all involved a variation on the same question, which is when do the states go too far in stepping into the areas that are regulated by the federal government, or conversely, when does FERC go too far and step into the areas that are regulated by the states? One Oak dealt with natural gas rates and the question of whether states could, state attorney generals could bring private rights of actions for antitrust violations under state law. The court permitted those actions to go forward, recognizing that those state actions would have an effect on the wholesale price regulated by FERC, but the court was comfortable with that idea and rejected the idea of a platonic dividing line between state and federal markets, suggesting that it was entirely appropriate for actions on one side of the jurisdictional line to have impacts on the other side of the line. FERC v. EPSA, which came down in January, some of you may be familiar with, it was about the FERC order 745 that permitted demand response to bid into the wholesale market. As those raising the jurisdictional objection pointed out, there are aspects of demand response that look retail in nature. It's about reduction in the ultimate consumption of electric energy. But the court was comfortable with the idea that FERC had not gone too far by letting demand response providers bid in as supply into the organized wholesale markets. Even though it was an area where there were joint state and federal responsibilities, that was an acceptable exercise of FERC's jurisdiction. And finally, the only case that struck down something as going too far, Hughes versus Talon, dealt with the capacity markets, dealt with the question of whether states could guarantee a rate for capacity to certain generators regardless of the output of the FERC jurisdictional markets. But there, too, the court emphasized the extent to which the preemptive scope of the Power Act permitted many state policies, policies in support of particular generation resources to survive. While that particular state structure was impermissible because it was setting a rate for capacity, many things states do appear to survive preemption after Hughes. So we've ended up in a situation where there's a fair amount of comfort in the U.S. Supreme Court with the notion of overlap between state and federal jurisdiction, where there are many players in one space. I think under some older case law, cases like Nantahala, the court was much more focused on emphasizing a bright line between state and federal jurisdiction. That line is much less clear now, and that certainly will be something interesting to see get litigated as we move forward. So I should have started by saying that I'm here speaking just as myself and not behalf of anybody, the Federal Regulatory Commission or the chairman. So let me just say that now. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody, and again, thank you to Ricky and to the Institute for the kind invitation to come up here to freeze a little bit after coming from Florida yesterday, where it was actually only 65 degrees, at least in Gainesville. I want to actually concentrate, hearing all of the discussions earlier about trends, Arvin and Sue in particular. I'm going to want to leave you with three things, and then we'll kind of dive into them in some detail and the discussions that we just heard. The first one is believe in markets. Markets work. I think some of the rhetoric that we've heard politically in the campaigns, and it doesn't matter which side of the aisle you sit on, there's almost a skepticism of markets, and markets don't work. And we see that being carried out now in RTOs, in FERC proceedings, that, oh, this market is broken, that market doesn't work. We should do something different. We should restrict trade. We should restrict options. I'm going to argue that that's a bad strategy, and I'll give you some examples why that's a bad strategy going forward. The second thing I want to leave you with is that the trends that you've heard about are unmistakable, and there are lots of other trends underneath the technology trends that we need to really pay attention to that are really driving forces, such that we're probably not going to turn back the clock. Coal is not going to come back. Is there anybody from the press here? Okay. Coal is not going to come back no matter how much we wish it, no matter how many good friends I've got in the state of West Virginia. The war on coal has been fought in technology one, kind of to Sue's point earlier, except I'll be a little bit more blunt about it. And then the last thing I'll leave you with is that the linkages in energy markets, and again, I want to emphasize the plural as Max has done, markets, are much more complicated than a lot of the simple sound bites. And again, on both sides of the aisle, both for those who are looking for environmental stewardship and others who are trying to turn back the clock to the days of when fossil fuels, and especially coal and oil, were king. And I'll get into those. So let's think about markets first. Why do we believe in markets? Well, I think Sue alluded to this earlier. I'm an economist as well. Markets are age, technology, fuel, process, size, neutral. If there's a market for electric energy, as Max has alluded to in his comments, it's a market for electric energy, nothing more. If there are environmental markets and markets for emissions, which we have in this country going back to the 90 amendments that Phil talked about in his remarks earlier today, those are markets for sulfur dioxide emissions or carbon dioxide emissions, as would be the case with the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or the markets for natural gas. It's just natural gas. It doesn't really matter where it's coming from. And so I say that knowing that there are people who have other desired outcomes. We worry about the environment. We worry about clean air, clean water. But there are easy ways to deal with that in the context of the markets that I'm talking about, especially the markets for electric energy. If we price out or cost out these attributes that are so important, they can be easily reflected in these markets to achieve both a lower cost outcome for electric energy, for example, as well as a lower cost environmental compliance outcome for cleaner air or cleaner water. And so these markets work together. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's think back to where we were with electricity, with regulation, little history lesson. We had these nice vertically integrated utilities, but that's not how the industry always was. If you go back to the start of the power industry, the days of Samuel Insull, electricity was a very competitive market. In fact, we have state regulation because the industry lobbied to be regulated to help foreclose new entry from competitors. And that's the way we operated for many years until the 1970s, where we saw PURPA, and then the 92 Energy Policy Act, where we saw the advent of exempt wholesale generators, and we started seeing competition. And now we're in this world of wholesale market competition. What has that led to? At least in the PJM footprint, it's an estimated savings of about $2 billion a year, which is just north of $3 a megawatt hour. And total wholesale costs in PJM so far this year are under $50 a megawatt hour. So we're talking about a savings between 5 and 10% of total wholesale costs. just by operating as a market, just by operating these broader regional dispatch and resource adequacy schemes and capacity markets. The same is also true for environmental markets. I'm glad Phil brought up the 90 amendments. It's a beautiful thing. The 90 Clean Air Act amendments, creating the market for sulfur dioxide emissions, was wildly successful in reducing the cost of compliance. Why? All that was required are emissions must be reduced so that in aggregate we're meeting the cap. It didn't say how, and all of a sudden innovation happened. Wow, you mean I can actually switch coals? I can use lower sulfur coal? Wow, we can actually get the cost of FGDs, AKA scrubbers, down to the point that in the early 2000s, the cost of scrubbers had fallen in half in nominal terms compared to what the estimates were at the beginning of the program. Innovation happened. In electricity markets, all of a sudden, now we've got gas versus coal. A decade ago, if we would have talked about a 7,000 heat rate, combined cycle unit, 7,000 heat rate is slightly more or slightly less than 50% thermally efficient in converting gas to electricity, people would have gone, wow, that's great. And now we're seeing vendors guaranteeing heat rates below 6,500, which is north of 60% thermal efficiency. And they can build the units cheaper and bigger than they've ever done before. That's the kind of innovation that markets have been able to unleash, which have allowed us to see emissions rates and total emissions falling over the last decade, at least in the PJM footprint. Even for coal units, they had incentives to become more thermally efficient, which also reduced their emissions as well. Now, not to the same extent that we're seeing with natural gas, but again, we're seeing that. There's that innovation here. But markets are also very transparent, hence the reason some folks don't like them. Because if you're holding a bad hand, let's say you're holding some generation that's just not very good, not very thermally efficient, really high cost, markets signal that maybe it's time for those resources to go away. And we've seen a lot of retirements in power markets. We've seen a lot of coal-fired retirements. We've seen a lot of retirements of old gas and oil steam units, which of course have had environmental implications to the positive. And so again, markets encouraging that sort of innovation and not discriminating, not picking winners and losers have worked well. And then finally, there's the issue of risk mitigation. As we heard the question about Nevada earlier, what is it about the regulated environment that seems so objectionable to many? Part of it is who bears the risk. As Sue already pointed out, utilities love certainty. They love being able to get that guaranteed rate of return. In wholesale markets, companies aren't guaranteed a rate of return. If they can do it better and more efficiently, they'll do very well. If they don't do it so well, the risk is all on them. And so we're seeing with a lot of these resources that are high cost, whether it's coal resources or certain nuclear resources in some states, I'm not going to mention here, I don't want to get shot at by anybody in the crowd, but say Illinois with Quad Cities and Clinton, or we've seen public power districts, OPPD just retired Fort Calhoun. They're saying, this is just too expensive for us, we're done. We're out of this. And markets are sending those signals. So what are the trends that we're seeing coming out of these markets? Well, obviously it's about natural gas. But it's about natural gas in ways that we haven't thought about. There's really two aspects here. The first aspect to natural gas is the fact that the productivity per well has increased by an order of magnitude in less than a decade. So today, with horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, the gas industry can extract far more out of a well than it could earlier. In talking to folks in the gas industry, they can recover their full capital investment in less than 9 months now on some of these new wells. The rest of it is gravy at that point. It's unreal what these folks can do. And they can be profitable at gas prices at $1.50 a million. And just a few years ago, nobody thought that anybody could be profitable below $3 a million. Guess what? Innovation and competition in the gas market works. And then, of course, there's transportation. It costs a lot less to transport gas from the wellhead to the ultimate end-use customer, whether it's power generation or a residential customer, than it does to move coal by rail on a unit train out of the Powder River Basin in Wyoming or out of the Central Appalachian coal fields in eastern Kentucky and West Virginia to their ultimate source. In fact, out of the Powder River Basin, transportation is a bigger component of cost than, excuse me, of the delivered cost than the actual commodity itself. That's not very efficient. Whereas with gas, it's just pennies on the dollar for transportation costs. And you don't have to actually run trains that consume fossil fuel, or trucks, or barges, or anything else. Once the pipe is in the ground, you're running the compressors. The compressors are a very light energy load relative to transportation. So you've got that going for you. The question about LNG came up. It's very interesting. LNG, there's really 2 trains that are in operation now in Louisiana that Cheniere operates, and they're trying to get permitted for new ones. I won't say anything more, Max. I don't want to get you in trouble. And there are others that are currently under consideration at FERC or have been permitted. But if you think about that, we're right now talking less than 2 BCF a day, 2 billion cubic feet per day. There's 3 times that being exported to Mexico every day. That's not having that big an impact on our pricing of natural gas. So exports are probably overblown. But the last big trend that I want to bring up is demand. No one's talked about demand yet today. Think about where we're at. We're in 2016. Now, I'm going to use PJM as the microcosm of the nation as a whole. But until the Great Recession, nationwide, there had never been 2 consecutive years of demand declines since the start of World War II. Now, it's an every year occurrence. Demand is either declining, it'll go up because of weather, and then it declines back down for a couple of years. Maybe go up again, it comes down again. In PJM, total energy demand, total gigawatt hours consumed at the wholesale level has remained flat 2012 through 2015 at levels seen in 2004. You have less demand, you have less fossil generation. Less fossil generation means lower emissions. What's causing that? It's not all energy efficiency, and it's not all behind-the-meter generation. There's been a secular change in how we consume energy, and this is a process that's been ongoing since the end of World War II. Taking EIA data, a couple years ago I made a presentation to the EIA annual conference, where if you just cut demand growth as a function of real GDP growth by decade, from the 50s to present, that relationship with GDP has been breaking down for decades. We just didn't understand it. It almost looks like we've gotten to a point where electricity demand is almost saturated. Even though we see load forecasts going up by 0.9% a year, we're still not meeting that. The load forecasts keep coming down, 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 and down. We're in a completely different regime in terms of energy demand, whether it's because of saturation, whether it's because real median incomes since 2007 have fallen until recently, whether it's because of the energy efficiency or behind-the-meter generation. Maybe it's a combination of all of them. But we're in a new world. Demand growth is not coming back, and it doesn't look like it's coming back anytime soon. So those are the big trends. Now, how about what are the linkages? Everybody loves to favor something. We, as policymakers in this industry, can't resist putting our hands on something. Steve, I love it. All of the above. Can I get an amen for that? Because we don't do a very good job of that in practice. Look at PURPA. Anybody remember PURPA? Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act, 1978. Let's go ahead and get these non-utility generators, NUGs was the term of art, and let's pay them the avoided costs. And by the way, states, it's your job to determine what avoided costs are. Those avoided costs were based on forecasts that were just wildly inaccurate, as it turns out. $100 a barrel oil in the early 80s, when oil turned out to be $20 a barrel or less, and some other assumptions. And so then you have these really high-cost generators generating with different types of fuels, cow manure, chicken litter, walnut shells, et cetera, et cetera. We picked winners, all right, and what did it beget us? PURPA begot us wholesale competition. So we got so heavy-handed in picking winners and losers, we got a cry for competition that this regulatory environment wasn't working for us very well. So the trend, so be careful what you wish for. Be careful putting fingers on the scale. My advice, whether this was going to be a Clinton administration or a Trump administration, be careful putting your fingers on the scale favoring renewables or nuclear or coal or gas or anything else. Because chances are something's going to happen to make that look like a bad decision. Because there's always value in waiting for technology and waiting for better information to come along rather than committing to something now. We've seen it time and again. What would happen if we favored coal? Well, I don't know. I mean, is coal ever going to become economic again? As Sue pointed out, the cost of building coal plants just isn't there. And the cost of maintaining existing facilities is exorbitantly high. Even without environmental controls, it's exorbitantly high. What if we favor nuclear, as we're doing in some states? Well, favoring nuclear means that those coal units that have been promised a new life, there's going to be pressure put on them. Because now you've got another low running cost source of energy on the system that's going to make coal hurt. What if we favor gas? Well, that's going to hurt coal and nuclear. What if we favor renewables? Well, it depends. If there is no clean power plan, it hurts fossil resources. If there's a clean power plan favoring renewables, counterintuitively, and this is found in studies that we did at PJM when I was there, that MISO has done, the Midwest System Operator, that renewables saves coal. Be careful what you wish for. The complexities here are enormous, and it's more than just a soundbite. And then lastly, states favoring particular generators. Again, there's headline prices and headline results. We used to hear this when I was at PJM about renewable portfolio standards. Well, all these renewables will drive wholesale prices down. Yes, they will. And there's still cost to recover for those renewable resources. And where's that going to end up? In some obscure line item on a retail bill. The same is true by favoring resources such as New Jersey and Maryland tried to do, hence the Hughes case. The same is true in Illinois trying to favor nuclear. That in a larger interconnected system, yes, those resources may be saved. And yes, it may help bring down energy prices or capacity prices. For the rest of the footprint, for the state in which that policy is being undertaken, what happens? The customers are paying to subsidize the rest of the footprint. And is that really a winner in what we're trying to shoot for here as policymakers in a state? Again, be aware of the complex interactions and the unintended consequences of putting one's finger on the scale. So I'll leave you with a song, quote. In the words of the late Warren Zevon, send lawyers, guns, and money. Thank you very much.
Can we put Max's map back up? Is that possible? I too start every morning looking at that map. I was just thinking maybe I could laminate it and put it, make it into placemats for my kids for breakfast so that we could all together start our day with the RTO map. I do think it's always grounding to have that there for the conversation. Well, thank you for having me on behalf of Natural Resources Defense Council here this afternoon. It's been a long day. I'm the last speaker. It's not an envious position, so hang in there for a few minutes. You know, I really appreciate the optimism today because I've been struggling for the last week, and I think it's okay to say that I feel sad. I feel sad for my kids about this election. I feel from a clean energy perspective, among others. And I feel sad for my organization that was getting into some really cool proactive opportunities to promote our clean energy future, and we, a bunch of our other friend organizations, are now about to go on the defensive. And so I appreciate the optimism that has come from today's conversation because it is true that not everything that we've done kind of goes away. That's helpful. I thought what I would do is provide about 4 points of context on some of these issues with a policy overlay on the future of our energy system, or our electricity system at least, and then make a couple of specific points about markets that relate to Max and Paul's comments. I don't have to make the electric sector transformation is underway comment again. I will just supplement it with one thought, and that is that renewable energy is not that big of a deal anymore from a grid integration perspective. The facts are on our side, our side, NRDC's side, when it comes to the idea that you can integrate high penetrations of renewable energy reliably. We've seen at one point in time 56% of the power on the CAISO system coming from renewable energy. At one point in time, we've seen 43, almost 44% of the energy on the SPP system come from renewable energy. And that's without not a lot of to-do. That's without developing new market products to support the variable nature of these resources, you know, without calling in the National Guard in case the lines go down across the entire system. It just isn't that big a deal. And so I think when we're having conversations with people in a new political environment, we need to start from that point. During the Clean Power Plan development, back in the good old days before the stay, there was a lot of conversation about how the sky was going to fall if you took all these generators off the grid and you put clean energy resources on. And I think we used facts effectively. I think Sue did as well, and lots of others in the room to push back on that argument. And so that's a good starting place. The second point, there are some things we know about how FERC is going to change and some things we don't know. We know it will change. Trump has the opportunity to appoint 3 of the 5 commissioners, and we'll have a new chair that comes along with him. But the politics, small p politics of energy regulation are funny, and they're not straightforward. They're complex, just like Paul describes the markets as complex. They're very much regional, and if you put your finger on any state on this map, the Federal Power Act and the way that FERC acts lands differently in that place, based on whether or not it's a vertically integrated state, whether or not there is a wholesale market overlay, or you're a restructured state and you're depending on your wholesale market for a lot more than some of the vertically integrated states do. It's an interesting dynamic if you think about Republican appointees to a commission at a time when we're going through this tension between states' authority and the federal government's authority that Max explained. So you've got people coming on who presumably, if they embody kind of traditional Republican perspective, want to promote state rights. At the same time, you've got clean energy advocates, you've got NGOs, the renewables industry, and just states who also want to put forth progressive clean energy policies and ensure that those policies don't get damaged. And so there's at least the opportunity for some interesting alignment there in terms of kind of, this doesn't feel like a time for great federal FERC overreach vis-a-vis the states with a new composition. And the last piece, of course, is that there are bounds on FERC's jurisdiction. FERC is not an environmental regulator. We go in there all the time and try and get them to do environmental things, and they say, we are not environmental regulators. It's our job to make prices fair for transmission and power sales. But they have to capture, you know, a new commissioner who really likes fossil fuel or who wants to turn back the clock and lock us back in 1996 and, you know, make us all use central station power all the time, implicitly they can do that by setting the agenda and by saying, you know, we're not going to go look at all the great things that demand-side resources can do for the markets. We're not going to create a level playing field. So yeah, that's a problem. But they can't just go and say, hey, you know, Utah, hey, SPP, hey, CAISO, start using coal resources more than you're doing. We don't like how you're going about it. I think since the failure of a proposed standard market to apply all the way across the country back in 2000, I think since then, every FERC has shown a lot of regional flexibility, the willingness to accept what the regions bring forth if they can get consensus around that opportunity. The third point of context is this consideration of the states as the leaders and the states as the laboratory for innovation. And I think we have to go there and continue to go there, and that's the role states have been playing. But we have a new kind of landscape of states following this election. We now have 22 states where Republicans control both the governor's office and the legislature. And of course, I'm speaking just from an observation perspective. I work for a nonpartisan organization, but as relates to clean energy and the amenability to it, you've got 22 states that are all the way Republican from a control perspective. You've got 6 states that are all the way Democrat, where the governor and the legislature are Democratic controlled. So we have to be able to speak to these states in their language, right, to change energy policy. Not all states are going to be New York. There isn't going to be a rev in every state. I moved from Brooklyn to Salt Lake City last year. Like, I know not all states are going to be like New York personally. And so how do you look at those vertically integrated utilities in states that want to maintain control? If you look at Sue's maps, you see where the wind blows and where the sun shines. Those are a lot of the states that aren't in the colored regions on this map that don't belong to RTOs. But they have cheap wind, cheap solar. They have tech companies moving into their states who want to do business either with them or in spite of them. And there's an opportunity there for those utilities to stay involved and to help be in control of the way that the process goes, while at the same time bringing on more clean energy. And my last point of context is there is always the risk of legislative change, and the idea of opening up the Federal Power Act is a little bit frightening in terms of being careful what you wish for. There's a lot of people who want to get in there, and we can try and clear up the state-federal preemption issues, but there's a lot of other things at risk, including PURPA, I think, from a rollback perspective. And that's a policy that's kind of breathed new life since we've had some of these commercial and industrial customers who want to purchase clean energy in states outside of the organized market regions. I think with that, I'll move into some specific thoughts on the markets. My coalition that I directed for the last 5 years is called the Sustainable FERC Project. It's a poorly named but well-intentioned and hopefully effective coalition of national environmental organizations as well as regional environmental NGOs who go to FERC in an attempt to level the playing field for clean energy resources, both on the demand side and on the supply side. And we spent a lot of time thinking about transmission system planning and wholesale market design. And there's a couple of things that I think are important when we take these next brave steps forward as relates to what markets should do, what wholesale energy and electricity markets should do. We have to start from the point that these markets were not designed to facilitate public policies, right? They were designed to increase competition in the case of energy markets and to provide, price signals that ensure we're going to have the power plants there we need either a month forward or a year forward or 3 years forward when we need that generation to be online. So now we have this issue where increasingly the entities that are selling power and capacity in those markets are subject to environmental regulations which are brushing up against their FERC jurisdictional obligations. These markets have to facilitate these public policies. If they don't, then the prices that are happening in these markets are not being disciplined by reality and therefore can't be assured to be just and reasonable, and that's FERC's obligation to ensure. On the transmission system planning side, Order 1000 is, as many of you know, is a rule that requires all of these regions, whether or not they're in color on the map or not, to engage in transmission system planning, to look at future needs, and to consider public policies. So on the planning side, FERC has said, and the courts have upheld, DC Circuit has agreed, that if you don't think about the public policies that are going to implicate the transmission needs on your system, your rates are not going to be just and reasonable. I don't know why we can't do that on the market side as well. If your market design does not recognize the reality of the costs that are happening from an environmental perspective, how are your rates just and reasonable? I think it's going to take a lot of reform to get there, and we have 3 principles, and that's the last thing I'll talk about in terms of how we start that conversation. First, do no harm on existing energy, carbon, environmental regulations and markets. So if we're going to talk about a carbon adder, which lots of people are talking about right now in the Northeast region, in the Mid-Atlantic region, in California, let's make sure that the cap and trade system we have in place in California, that RGGI system maintains its integrity until it's either strengthened or replaced by something stronger. And that's an important starting point. You're not going to solve our carbon problems by having FERC as an energy regulator coming in and kind of deciding that this is how we're going to price carbon and leave it at that. It's more complex. And the corollary on that point is that let's respect these states, both the ones that are doing things like California and New York, but also the ones like Utah and other states who are in a position to create their own energy policies, who want to have that freedom, but who might not be on the progressive leading edge. In fact, NRDC filed, this is one example, filed at the New York PSC in support of the state's right to create the New York ZEC, the Zero Emission Credit Program, despite the fact that on a policy basis we didn't want to see that happen because we think it's important to maintain that state authority. The second market principle is that you have to recognize the contributions of all resources on the grid in market design, both those resources that are participating in the market and the ones that aren't. And Paul got to this a little bit. If you think about how much energy efficiency, for example, is existing in the states in any one of these colored regions, if you're not counting that energy efficiency when you decide how much energy or how much capacity you need 3 years from now to ensure that all the customers have the electricity they need, then you're going to overprocure and you're going to make customers pay more than they need to. PJM was able to reduce its load forecast by 4,700 megawatts in 4 years just by counting the existing energy efficiency resources that are happening in its states. Also, and goes to the don't pick winners and losers. It's a part of this all resources second principle. Create the platform for everybody who has the technical ability, all the resources that have the technical ability to participate in markets to participate. So just like FERC required demand response to be allowed to participate in energy markets, when you think about storage, when you think about aggregated electric vehicles, when you think about any other type of demand-side resource, if they can provide a resource, let them do it. Just create the platforms that everybody can play. If wind and solar can provide power to the grid, but not at all hours of the day, let them bid in when they can provide it, so that we're not getting more resources in line we need. And then last goes to this point, and that's make sure that markets are developing the right sets of services and products that the system actually needs to facilitate this electric sector transformation that's already taking place. And so a blunt capacity product that requires, a central station dispatchable power plant to be available 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, is really locking in kind of a past, reliability 1.0, and we're past that. We've moved beyond that. And so let's think about what products a future resource, adequacy market or an ancillary service market needs to provide in order to kind of most cost effectively facilitate this transition that's already taking place. And I think that's it. Thanks.
Thanks to all the speakers for those super enlightening introductory remarks. I have a few questions I'm going to start by asking, and then we'll open up to the audience for questions. So first, given the fact that President-elect Trump listed infrastructure development as one of his key priorities, do you see potential applications of this goal in the energy sector, potential opportunities with that?
Yes.
What sorts of
No,
opportunities?
actually, it's more than just yes. I think that there are several things. I think my old CEO, Terry Boston, once said, if you love wind, you have to love transmission, for the very reasons that we've already heard here today. But I think that there's another one, and I'll lobby Max here since I have him to my left a little bit, is not just gas pipeline infrastructure, because right now gas can't get out of the Northeast region very easily, whether it's to the north into New York with the Constitution pipeline issue currently ongoing, or even further up into New England, or even backhauling it south into the Southeast or out into the Midwest. And so I think that there's going to be a need for new gas pipeline infrastructure, and a lot of it is already in front of the commission. I won't get into any specific projects, but a lot of it's already there. It's going through the approval process. There's been open seasons held. There are shippers already signed up on a lot of these potential projects. But I think there's one tweak that needs to be done, and I'm going to channel Phil Moeller here, who recently left the commission, and that is the idea of having merchant pipeline capacity. That is, rather than the standard model of getting a certificate of need and having shippers through an open season, let developers develop a pipeline, build it and they will come kind of model. In a very similar way that we often see electricity. We have merchant transmission projects where a lot of it, while there may be some shippers, it's not fully subscribed on it, and you can then charge the price differences between the two ends of, say, a DC tie between PJM and New York, for example. I think there needs to be more of that kind of entrepreneurial activity that's allowed, and right now that's not currently allowed. But I think that would help get some of this infrastructure built, and especially in places like New York and New England, where in the wintertime, getting gas to power generation, and it's competing with residential heating load, is a huge problem. And if you can do the build it and they will come, if somebody's willing to take that risk, that might help alleviate a lot of that. Of course, then the folks building that pipeline will capture the rents from that.
Anyone else want to jump in?
I meant to preempt Paul on this in my comments, and I forgot. So when we think about the infrastructure opportunity,
It's good to see you too, Allison.
on the electric side, there is a real opportunity to gain consensus around putting money into high voltage transmission lines that we need to get to renewable energy resources in large quantities. On the natural gas pipeline side, it's an entirely different conversation. The process at FERC is broken when it comes to comprehensive consideration of the need for and the impacts of new pipelines. On the transmission side, the states do it, and it makes it hard to get transmission through, but it gets a good look. And at the same time, on the federal level, regions are looking at transmission lines on a regional basis at least. Hopefully, we'll push it to an interregional basis, which doesn't really happen right now. And therefore, there's some consideration of whether there's redundancies and the potential of building 2 transmission lines when you only need 1, or you could reconduct or something else. On the pipeline side, FERC is subject to a 1999 policy statement, which is one of the oldest policy statements that is still, it hasn't been updated at FERC. And it doesn't require that consideration of whether or not there's actual need. And it's, we might differ on how much what the resource mix is gonna look like 30 years from now, but I think we need to be really careful if we're going to build out pipelines that last for 80 years, that we really need them. And so I'm not suggesting that we're not gonna build more pipelines, we're gonna have to, but I think some of the issues in terms of transporting gas in the Northeast have been addressed by merely kind of coordination on market days between the electric and the gas markets and other operational things that at least start to get at that problem that Paul talks about. And so I think in that case, the infrastructure opportunity really lies on the transmission side, not on the gas side.
Anyone else? Nope, okay. So given the fact that Congress and the president are both Republican now, at least nominally, do you think an updated energy bill might be a realistic possibility? Allison alluded to this a little bit in her comments, but do you think such a bill would be a possibility, and what would your personal list of dream features you would want to see in such a bill consist of?
Wow, don't everybody all jump up at once. I'm kind of in the camp with Sue on this one, Sue Tierney on this one. I just don't see any way possible that we'll ever see a comprehensive energy policy in this country. I just don't see politically how it can happen. And it doesn't matter whether it's necessarily Democrat or Republican. I mean, one would think if you have one party controlling, both the executive branch and the legislative branch, that it's possible. But look at all the years that was the case when the Democrats controlled the House and Senate and had the White House. Didn't happen then. And it's probably not going to happen with Republicans controlling the White House and both the House and Senate. I think that Phil pointed out, I think correctly in his remarks earlier this afternoon, that there are a lot of different interests and there are different shades of red out there. And we might see that now come to the fore now that one party is in control of both the White House and both the House and Senate, and it probably would make it impossible, I would suspect.
Okay, cool.
Just let the record reflect that one party doesn't control the presidency in the House and Senate yet.
Oh,
Yeah.
Will,
Yeah.
yes, yeah, yes, correct. Okay, so with that, we'll open up to the floor for more questions. And I'd just like to remind the audience that due to ex parte rules, Max cannot be part of the discussion of pending FERC matters. So please refrain from asking questions about pending matters, including the New York ZEC, because it is tied to pending transfer motion of a plant. So let's start with this gentleman right back here. And Dina will give you a microphone.
Hi, thank you. I'm wondering where water fits into this. Who regulates it? Because there's no part of the production of energy, sourcing it, the equipment that is needed for it, to produce it, the transmission, that water isn't there. Some forms of energy, as you know, use much more electricity, much more water in their process than others. We have profound water shortages. And there's a competition, so I'm wondering, it's out there, it's never discussed, and I'm wondering, where does this resource fit in, because we can't reproduce water?
Do you want to go ahead?
I think that's a really interesting question. FERC has some jurisdiction that touches on water in the context of hydroelectricity. There are many facilities that are licensed by FERC to produce hydroelectric power. Other federal agencies have a role in it in terms of water management on federal lands, but there's a very significant state component to it. And a very large part of sort of the core property rights questions about water are questions of state law. So I think it is a situation where there isn't one person who's comprehensively in charge of it.
I was going to say, let me add to that. I think that what you're seeing a lot of now is that the new generation that's coming online, and it doesn't matter what part of the country, it could be California, where you've got discharge limits, even using ocean water for cooling. Everybody's going with air-cooled, combined cycle facilities now. I've talked to generation developers in the Marcellus region, which are either in the Susquehanna River and Chesapeake Bay watershed area or the Delaware River watershed area, and they're often thinking it's just much easier to go with an air-cooled facility rather than building the infrastructure and taking the chance that you can't get the cooling water. And it does become an issue even with impingement and entrainment. The Clean Water Act 316B rule, which basically, define the best technology available, left it to the states to define that, and the states are going to implement that differently. But we're seeing that, we're seeing a nuclear plant in large measure retiring in New Jersey because there's simply not the footprint to put closed-loop cooling in place. And so we are seeing those effects happening, but the jurisdictional issues, to Max's point, are just spread all over the map. And it's not just with the water resource itself, but the waterway itself. And there's currently an issue ongoing in Virginia to build a new 500 kV transmission line over the James River, and that's now subject to the Army Corps of Engineers permitting and giving approval for that. And that's to serve the largest naval base that we have down in Norfolk and Hampton Roads. And so, the jurisdictional problem may be the bigger issue because I think people are responding to the environmental issues at this stage.
All right, how about up here in the front in the blazer? And Bridget has a mic for you.
So I'd like to present a possibility that you're looking at the system as a static system, and it might actually be in great transformation, way beyond what any of you are considering, and that impacts if we go back to Sue's discussion from before, an assumption that the increase in gas and the decrease in coal is a positive thing, and that the Clean Power Plan is a positive thing because it promotes gas over coal, and that all of that might be suspect. So I want to raise that as question the assumption to start. So, and then I'll tell a little story, which is that I was involved in the computer technology business going back into the early 80s, and IBM was king. We all know this story, so I'll tell it in 2 sentences. It was all a mainframe world, and nobody saw it coming. And within 10 years, it was over. 10 years it took to destroy an entire industry. And now you pick up a cell phone. So I developed an application, a 3D visualization application in 1985, 1986, where we put a board in a PC by cutting a hole in the PC that was as powerful as RCA's mainframe. And now we have cell phones that are, 1,000 times more powerful than that PC that I had on my desk. So what if all of these assumptions are wrong and all of this is overbuilding? And what's happening is that it's all going to become decentralized. So what would happen, and how does, particularly FERC and everybody else, how do you envision what hasn't happened and, in fact, made Trump help in this by deregulation? By getting the regulators out of this, and it's funny for me to be saying this, is that possibly a positive thing that you do let these forces that are unstoppable, when you have technological changes, they're completely, you can't regulate them out of business. They're unstoppable. So I'll ask, how do you see that playing out if that were to play out within your various roles? And should you be approving pipelines, particularly pipelines that end west of Albany and don't increase capacity to New England? Should you be approving pipelines that are not doing what they say they're doing and building infrastructure for that consumers will end up paying for product that we're not going to need in 20 years?
Sure. So I'm trying to, what's the Yogi Berra line? It's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. So it's a hard question. Let me say something that's maybe partly responsive. And it goes back to what I was suggesting are investments in leapfrog technologies. Like, by definition, you don't know what they are, right? But batteries is something that we as a society and we as a department are heavily invested in. That could transform how we drive cars. We are heavily invested in pushing out to the limits of the laws of physics the yield from solar. And that's not just really advanced solar cells, but it is, to pick a real example, clothing. You know, our kids or grandkids will probably charge their iPhones, on their clothes. That's within the future. There's advanced distributed generation, and we can only imagine a shadow of what the world will look like. Again, kind of by definition. But I think your observation/question underscores, the importance of multiple investments in multiple technologies, potential leapfrog technologies, many of which will not bear fruit, but a subset that's hard to pick today will bear fruit. And I might add, part of it is about imagining the future from a purely technical point of view, and there's a kind of a cousin issue, I think, which is a social issue. Again, back to driving. So for my taste, I'm always taking UberX, not Uber. What's the pool? Uber pool? No. I one car, one person, kind of for me. But there is a generation of people who think about automobile transportation in a fundamentally different way, right? And they share cars, and they have driver share programs, and so forth. So we can't, it's hard to speculate. But I think your observation again highlights the importance of multiple investments in multiple vectors, technological and social as well.
Anyone else?
I mean, that's like the several trillion-dollar question, right? And maybe not answering your question, but one that's more incremental is that, and people were alluding to it earlier today on policy failing to catch up with technology, and that's what we've been looking at, and that's why the Supreme Court, one of the reasons the Supreme Court's had 3 times to think about this in the last 18 months, as Max said, is keep this all neutral. Remove barriers so that there is still a big grid. There's, studies are worth whatever, a cup of coffee, but they as far as forward as we can see, there's going to be at least some social net need to have a big grid for the people who can't supply it for themselves. And if that's the case, take away the barriers that allow certain resources with certain types of attributes to participate, provide that platform, and then let everybody go for it and figure it out.
Yeah, and let me add to that. I think I'm going to actually pull a quote that I like to tell Sue and others. The last time I checked as an economist, the laws of economies of scope and scale have not yet been repealed, just like the laws of physics haven't been repealed, in terms of loop flows, like Enron used to claim back 15 or more years ago. I think that Allison is hit on a key point here, is that you almost need a bigger system. And one of the things where markets work well, if you do it large enough. The Western system is the poster child for this. California, you have the issues with now wanting to achieve a 50% renewable standard in short order, and they have this so-called duck curve, where you have, actually low net renewables is actually lowest in the middle of the day, and then you have these huge ramps in the morning and the evening when the sun goes down and the wind stops blowing, or the wind starts up eventually at some point. And you need that diversity of resources both geographically, you need that scope. So that's why you see other entities joining California, not in the ISO per se, although there is now a Nevada utility that is in the California ISO. You're now seeing all of these Western utilities all over west of the Rockies joining the energy imbalance market for exactly this reason that Allison talked about. Is because there's so many renewables, and it's not just wind, and it's not just solar, it is hydro. And having that infrastructure to back that up is going to be important. And why is that? Because I can guarantee you that anything that goes to the commission, part of being just and reasonable is going to be reliable. Nobody wants to see the lights go out. And so having that backup there is going to be crucial until people can live with the fact that maybe they're not going to have power 24/7. I think this decentralized issue is a reliability issue more than anything else, but we're still going to need this big infrastructure to back it up.
All right. Back corner over here in the gray.
Hi, I wanted to ask, I guess, more of a legal question about the potential interaction between the Federal Power Act and the possibility of carbon taxes. And I say that because I assume we're going back to sort of a Bush administration playbook where a lot of states, a lot of blue-controlled states, start looking around and looking at options like RGGI, and then you had California thinking about joining RGGI, and Ontario and Canadian provinces looking at joining RGGI, and now the Canadians have created a harmonized Canada-wide carbon tax, very low at this stage. I can imagine that there may be states in the U.S. that are thinking or will think of possibly joining it, not in the electric sector, but economy-wide, so all fossil fuels at input. And the question is, if somebody tried to make that move, does that run up against the Federal Power Act and the current federal supremacy in terms of carbon adders, the recent Supreme Court cases, and or in a Trump administration, could it be interpreted as running up against the Federal Power Act?
Well, I think it's a great question. Obviously just speaking for me, and it probably depends on how it's structured, but those aren't totally unfamiliar models, right? You mentioned RGGI. RGGI is something that exists and exists within the market structures as administered by the Commission. Now, there's been some discussion of the Clean Air Act and the treatment of SOX in the cap and trade regime. At just a high level, those are costs that get passed through the organized wholesale electric markets. They get incorporated into the bids of units that have emission standards. In my view, it's actually a real sign of the success of the market-oriented structures, that it allows those policy changes that occur at the state level to pass through and be reflected in the overall market structure. Again, it would depend on exactly what type of structure you're talking about, but I don't think there's a necessary conflict between the federal statute and those state policy initiatives.
Yeah, I think that there's a fine line here, and I'm not a lawyer, but there's a fine line. I think RGGI, clearly there's been no issues. But California with the AB 32 program, RGGI doesn't address leakage. So if there's imports into the RGGI region, so for example, in PJM, you've got Maryland and Delaware that are part of the PJM system, and the RGGI costs are included in the generation costs for the generators in Delaware and Maryland, but Maryland and Delaware do not try to enforce anything on the generators outside of RGGI. AB 32 in California is a little bit different. Now you've got California trying to reach and say, well, you generation or energy coming into the into California, we're going to try to come up with some sort of proxy price for carbon dioxide, and that's where things get probably a little bit dicey, is trying to address that so-called leakage issue, which makes it easier just to have, either what RGGI does or just have everybody in to make it happen. So it'll be interesting to see whether that gets taken up, at some future date. But I know there's something that the Commission has tried to look at, and I don't know if that's not in front of you guys. So.
All right, one last question. Up here in the blue blazer, and Dina has a mic for you.
Yeah, hi. Stephen, you said we shouldn't make predictions about the future, but I'm going to, as part of this question. Okay. Sometime in the future, we're going to stop doing what we do today, and that is using combustibles, either fossil fuels or biofuels, as the primary means of delivering energy to end-use applications. Electricity today is much less than 50% of the energy we actually deliver to end use. Now, we can argue about when that's going to happen. I think it's going to be around 2050. Somebody else might say it's 2100. I don't care. It's going to happen sometime in the future. Now, Paul, you said beware of assumptions, but then you also said very emphatically, demand growth is not coming back. Well, if you were talking about energy, I believe that, because we're getting more efficient. But if you're talking about electricity, I think we need to rethink this, because electricity today is not the primary means of delivering energy to end-use applications. It is the fossil fuels. If we replace the fossil fuels primarily in transportation and in heating applications, as well as for cooking, which is well over 50% of the energy that gets delivered to end users, we're going to need a tremendous more electricity. So we'll see electricity demand go up in the future as our on-site combustion goes down. I'm very concerned because today everybody seems to be looking at the short-term curve that shows that, yes, in the short term, electricity demand is going down, without recognizing that in order for us to reduce our energy demand long-term, we're actually going to have to see essentially a second great electrification of our country, and we're going to have in our society, and we're going to in fact see an increase in electricity demand in the future. So how do we maintain long-term good policy development, which should be targeting significantly increased electrical production, even though we do have this short-term interim period in which we'll see electrical demand go down?
If I said beware the assumptions, I don't think I meant to say that. What I'm talking about was beware of putting your thumb on the scale in favor of one technology over another. So if I said assumptions, then that was not my intent at all. But in terms of the electrification, I think that's consistent with what the story I was telling earlier is that after World War II, we saw this huge electrification of our lives in this country. Yeah, we saw single-family residential housing being built in this country on a scale that we had never really seen before. We saw the electrification of our lives, with cooking rather than cooking with wood or coal or gas, cooking with electricity, all of these new great appliances. And then as we started going into the next generation of that, we saw, improvements in efficiency of those technologies. And so to the extent right now, absent any technological change that would require more electrification, I just don't see where demand is going to go up. But your point is well taken. If there's electrification of the transportation sector. And heating. Well, actually heating, people are moving away from electric heating at this point. There's actually a movement away from that in a lot of places.
It's on the radar, I think, this conversation. Every night when I turn on my beautiful gas-fired stove, I say, your days are numbered, mister. I think about it every day, and certainly at NRDC, we have in our modeling pretty aggressive assumptions around electrification of the vehicle fleet and around end-use electrification in order to get to renewable penetration that we need to keep it below a 2-degree increase. So I think your point is it's not that people aren't talking about that. It is on the radar, and it is an important thing to be having the conversation about.
If there's a technological breakthrough, clearly that's going to increase demand. Or if there's going to be electrification of the transportation fleet, yeah, that's going to change matters. But given where we're at today, given the trends, I just don't see it happening. We're going to be pretty flat.
Please join me in thanking the panel. This was a great discussion. And we're going to welcome up, is Mike doing the final closing? We're going to welcome up our Senior Advisor and Founding Executive Director, Mike Livermore.
Great. I'm basically going to say almost nothing. Thanks very much to the staff for putting this together. Thanks to our speakers. Thanks to all of you. We've heard a lot of optimism today. I'm not fully feeling all the optimism, but I think it's good to keep that in mind because there is something worth fighting for, and we also need to plan for the bad scenarios, and let's all kind of keep the fight going. All right, thanks very much.